Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering, of course, your Arizona Cardinals, with my co-host, Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's NFL site for the Arizona Cardinals, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast, and we are on episode 370. That's a lot of episodes if you've been following us all the way back to 2013, back when our audio quality was a little worse, and we said things like, we think we're seeing Michael Floyd becoming the top receiver on this. Yeah, I don't think we'll ever live that one down. If anyone remembers, go back and listen to it. But it's cutdown day, so this edition of the show happens after we were recording on a Tuesday night, after the Cardinals have made final cuts. If you recall our last show, we predicted our final roster. We predicted the 53-man roster, and we didn't, there were some, it matched up somewhat, but the rosters were cut down Tuesday, and we are recording and reacting on Tuesday night. So more roster moves are to come. And that will, by the time you hear this show, it's very possible that those moves have already been done. But Seth, are you ready? Because we are now under 2 weeks away from actual NFL football. We have a team with 53 players. We have locker room access happening again as of starting next week. We had a locker room access after the game in the preseason. It is almost as if we are back to a normal.
Yeah, we're almost there, man. It's almost like real football time again. 3 years, almost 3 years later, but it's getting there. We've obviously seen some of the changes, and it's one of those situations where today sucks. It's one of our least favorite days, because I don't think people realize how much, like, especially you who's on site all the time, like, gets to know and see these players, especially the guys that typically are on the fringe. They are really open to access and things like that, because this might be the only chance they get, right, to have these conversations and talk to people like Jess, and so it's always a bummer, but it's also something that we know happens every year, and so it's just one of those things, like, it's more difficult, I think, now, like you said, that you're getting back to normal and you're seeing the players. I don't want to say daily, but you're seeing the players way more often. You're in the locker room a little more. It's a little more intimate, and you're like, oh man, this kind of stinks.
Yeah, it is one of the times, and it's also, as we know, every year in the preseason and training camp, there are players who fans get attached to, and their performance in the preseason excites people, and therefore they seem like locks for the roster. And over the years, and I will say this, one of these times, I will probably circle back around to a couple of former NFL players who never quite made it. It is a very rough. It is, once you're in the NFL and you're established, it's a great life. You get lots of money, but until you are actually established, that life is rough. Your life,
well, especially
you're on hold, because you still got to work out, but you're not in. But so you fly out to places, and if you've got a day-to-day job, it's very hard to keep up that dream for very long if you don't catch on somewhere.
Yeah, and it's just one of those situations where like you said, if you want to continue to compete and try, you're usually spending your own money on top of all of that, right? Like,
or you've got a support system with family who's kind of supporting you until you either make it or give up on it.
Right. And so, like, that's the thing is, like, a guy like Greg Dortch, who's made the initial 53-man roster, like, his story is fantastic to hear about, read about, talk to him about, like, just the perseverance that I had to go through. And now, like you said, like, he's going to make, $350,000-$400,000 this year. If
it's even more, like the league minimum, like $700,000 now.
Oh, is it not?
Yeah.
See, and so, like, those are the guys, we cheer for and we root for, but it's also really interesting because, like you said, fans get so stinking attached to some of these guys that just were never going to be on the roster, sans an injury to another player. Like, it would have had to have been, it would have had to been, and, like, you don't want to say it this way, but, like, divine intervention for, somebody like Tanner
somebody
Wooten
else's misfortune brings you fortune, and that's a very hard thing to deal with. But yeah, and those of you listening to us for the first time, or those who've been with us for a while, while we definitely have players we like and we wish who could make the team, we also have been around covering the team now for long enough that we know kind of how they tend to work things. And that's kind of what we're going to break down in this edition of the show. Is we're going to talk about we're going to go through the roster cuts. Are there any surprises? There are some surprises, let's be honest. We'll go through who is on the roster. So who are the surprises to get cut? Who are the surprises to be on the roster? And who could be out with who could be out off the roster with the next wave of moves that are forthcoming for sure. The Cardinals did make a trade for a cornerback. We'll go over that. We will discuss which players we think could be coming back on the practice squad and what are the moves that we still need to do. So let's kick things off. The Cardinals are now down to 53 players on their roster, and they did it there were a total of, I think, 21 players they released outright. They placed one player on injured reserve. They had two vested veterans, so basically 6 players who left with injury settlements or will be leaving with injury settlements. And then, of course, DeAndre Hopkins is not on the final 53 right now because he is exempt from the Cardinals roster as he begins his suspension. We'll kind of go through, let's go through the players and who was cut at the end. So they cut both backs. So the Cardinals keep 2 quarterbacks. They cut Trace Mcsorley and Jared Guarantano. The running backs, they didn't cut any of them that were left. At receiver, they cut Andre Bocelli. They cut Victor Bolden Jr., and their 2 undrafted kids, Kirkland and Javonte Payton. At tight end, they cut Steven Anderson. They cut Bernhard Seikovits. And the other tight end, Chris Pierce, got waived injured, so he will, if he doesn't get claimed, he will revert to IR and will likely get an injury settlement at some point. On the offensive line, they released, not surprisingly, Rashad Cower, Danny Isadora, and then they Coda Martin, and Marquise Hayes, one of their 7th-round picks. He ends up on injured reserve, ending his season. And then Joshua Miles is waived injured. Justin Murray gets an injury settlement. And Greg Long, a tryout guy that was signed and cut and signed again, played towards the end, got an injury. Will end up on IR after he clears waivers and will get an injury settlement at some point. Defensive line, the veterans that they brought in, Christian Ringo and Antoine Woods, both were cut. Ringo gets an injury settlement, and they cut ties with undrafted rookie Manny Jones. At outside linebacker, they cut veteran Devon Canard, and also rookie Jesse Luketa, one of their 7th-round picks. At inside linebacker, they cut Joe Walker, and then undrafted linebacker Chandler Wooten. The cornerbacks that they cut Jace Whitaker, they cut Josh Jackson. They had already kind of made some moves at cornerback already. And at safety, Tay Daly. James Wiggins cut, and Tay Daly gets waived injured, so he got waived with an injury designation, that sort of thing. So we've got, and then Hopkins got moved from the active roster to the suspended list. So Hayes is the only one on injured reserve. They have 4 players that will end up there, and Josh Miles, Greg Long, Tay Daly, Chris Pierce, and then Justin Murray and Christian Ringo both were released with injury salves. They're vested veterans, and so they just go on their merry way, sign somewhere else at some point. As we go through this list for you, Seth. Oh, and I forgot to mention as well, long snapper Aaron Brewer was also released. We'll talk that about in just a second. But of all this list, what were your biggest surprises?
It's tough because you look at it, like you said, you just kind of like read through all of it. There wasn't anything that stood out. I was a little surprised to see they cut Lucetta after they cut Devon Canard. You and I assumed that Canard would make the roster, and then once they cut him, I think you and I both assumed that meant they wanted to try and keep Lucetta. And so that one was interesting. We talked about the James Wiggins situation. I think last year they basically were like, hey, let's see where you're at athletically after the knee injury, because he wasn't back, his senior year at Cincy. He didn't look the same, and he just has never looked the same again. Explosive, linear athlete, just doesn't have that change of direction skill. Mcsorley was a little interesting just because it seemed like they would want to keep him around, but I think just with how the NFL is right now with quarterbacks, I don't really think they were that worried about him, especially his last 2 performances were so bad.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a surprise that he got cut. It was a surprise based for me. I raised my eyebrows at it because Cliff Kingsbury basically said we're probably going to go with 3 quarterbacks, and I think they wanted to keep him on the roster because honestly they would probably rather him come back than have to train another quarterback or potentially bring back Garantano. They like Mcsorley. He's obviously limited. It's kind of, if it's Colt McCoy, he's a poor man's Colt McCoy, let's say.
Right.
If you go with that. There were really only 2 surprises for me. Like, none of them I was shocked about. All the young guys, the undrafted guys, I was not at all surprised that they were all released. It was just because of the way the team was already built. On a less talented team, Chandler Wooten makes the roster. Manny Jones makes the roster. And probably one of the undrafted receivers might make the roster, especially Javonte Payton, who received specific praise about his play on special teams. But this year has more talent at different positions. So Devon Canard was a surprise. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, how would you do that? It wasn't a surprise because I think he's that critical to the team. It was a surprise because they guaranteed over half of his salary when they redid his deal. And being that they have so little experience. So you've got Marcus Golden, that's fine. Dennis Gardeck isn't exactly proven. Canard at least is a known quantity at outside linebacker, a known commodity there. And so I thought I felt the entire offseason he was a lock. But to have him released and to have them eat that $600,000 in guaranteed salary was a little surprising. Less surprising because of the emergence of Victor Dimukeje and the fact that they have Myjai Sanders and Cameron Thomas. But, for a team that wants to succeed this year, that wants to go farther, deeper into the playoffs, to then get younger and younger at critical positions seems different. It's kind of like the anti-Kansas City Chiefs when they built their team a couple years ago, because they just added, they stockpiled veteran talent on defense. And the Cardinals are going the opposite way on that. They are building up a lot of youth. They have a lot of young players. Devon Canard surprised me. Aaron Brewer was the biggest shock. But once you get past the initial shock of it, you realize, no, there was a reason for that. That his release is purposeful, and he's not actually going anywhere, because they wouldn't release their long snapper unless they had another long snapper that they've been trying out. And Aaron Brewer has been doing it for a long time, and when he's been out, the kicking game has been a disaster. This is simply a procedural move strategically, because he is a vested vet, does not have to go through waivers. Basically, he is nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Hey, we're going to cut you because we're going to sign you back tomorrow after we place a couple of guys on injured reserve. And that way, so, hey, Aaron, don't sign with another team. You're going to be back. Don't pack your bags. Just go home, and we'll have you back at the facility tomorrow. So I'm not surprised. I'm surprised that's what happened, but it makes sense why they did it, because they have some injuries. They have some injuries that of players who are probably going to go on injured reserve. I'm thinking at least 2.
Right, and that's what it comes down to, and I think that's what some fans don't understand. So I'm gonna obviously this is gonna be some inside baseball talk tonight, so just hang on to your hat. But teams when they build, they do it a couple of different ways. The first thing that they do is they look at obviously the entire positional groups, right? And so you just kind of ran through everything, right? So one of the groups that's really interesting and important to the Cardinals obviously is wide receiver, and so they love Antoine Wesley. They love him. Whether or not you agree with it doesn't matter. That's just the reality of the situation. Yeah,
he was going to make this team.
Right. And so he might be a guy that ends up on the IR, designated return, misses the first 4 games of the season type of situation. Now you have to remember too, they only have, what did you say, 6 of those they can use this year? I can't remember.
It's 8. They can designate up as many as 8. It's not unlimited, but it's also not the 2 it used to be.
Right. And so Wesley, they wanted on this roster. They did not want to cut Greg Dortch or Andy Isabella. Dortch because he earned the spot. Isabella, he earned his spot, and if they can get something for him, they'll be willing to do that, right? And so you look at it and you go, okay, let's look at a guy like Jesse Lemonnier, who had a nice preseason for the Cardinals. Or one preseason game, I guess I should say, for the Cardinals.
He had a good half.
And people were like, why did they cut him? Well, we talked about the cutting guys that are veterans that may, to give them an opportunity to go elsewhere. We also have to look at it as this. They cut him to let him go look elsewhere. Nobody signed him. And now, as Jess and I said last week, there are 1,000 free agents. And so Lemonnier is a guy that you could literally see coming back and being on the practice squad. And so that's what you do, is you go through it and you go, okay, Dortch isn't making it to the practice squad, right? Isabella is not going to make it to the practice squad. But you know what? Jesse Luketa probably would make it to the practice squad. I'm not going to say he will. But you look at
let's think of it this way. He wasn't a sought-after draft pick because they picked him 256th out of 263. It's not like teams were banging down his door to get him. And what you're going to see is that, and as we saw in the COVID years, what teams end up valuing more than anything are guys that have already learned their system, unless they're a special talent.
Right. And so that's what it kind of boils down to, right? So these cuts that fans are like, what? Why Chandler Wooten get cut? Well, he got cut because the Cardinals don't. Who's he going to play in front of? He's not going to play in front of Nick Vigil right now because Nick Vigil is probably going to quote unquote start alongside Zaven Collins while Isaiah Simmons is playing the star position and kind of roaming the defense, right? And so, I mean, and I'm not saying it's right, but from what we know about Vance Joseph's defense, do you really think that Vance was going to go with an undrafted rookie, a second year player that's basically going to be in his rookie live season, and a third year guy that they're tasking with
everything?
Basically being the heartbeat of the defense. Like, that's just not how this group works. So you can say like, well, he deserved. Well, maybe he deserved it over Ezekiel Turner or.
But Turner was a lock for the roster anyway because he's a special teams ace. And I will say this is a factor about Zeke Turner that's underappreciated because ideally we never see him. He offers the Cardinals a type of player who has some of the same type of skills that Isaiah Simmons has. Because he's a former decent defensive back. He came out of Washington as a safety and moved to linebacker. And now, thanks to, he followed in the footsteps of Devon Buchanan, but now as the league sort of evolves, having someone who can do a lot of things. So Simmons is going to do a lot of things. Like, he's going to play in the box, he's going to rush the passer. But if you have a guy like Turner who can play that position and do the things in coverage, at least at a great value for a great value Isaiah Simmons. It's a very, very poor man's Isaiah Simmons, but there are a few players who have his type of skill set. He at least has somewhat of one. So he was always going to be on the roster. Plus, he's a special team stud.
Right. And so, that's just the way you have to look at it. So, if they put Wesley on the IR to return, right, they wanted him to have that ability. We were actually surprised they IR'd Marquise Hayes, just outright.
Yes, because his rookie year is gone.
Right. Because, I mean, and again, I'm not saying this is accurate or any inside information, but you're telling me you could have cut Ben Neiman and done the same kind of handshake, like wink wink nudge nudge, see you tomorrow, and then put Hayes on the IR. So it's interesting how they go about it, how they build things, how they the rooms that they look in and try to figure things out, and you look at like we said, the offensive line. Those were locks. I mean, I don't think anybody had. The question was if they kept both Hayes and Smith. That was literally the only question. The cornerback room. Are we shocked? We literally called it beforehand. We were like, oh yeah, it's going to be Murph, Wilson, Hamilton, and Matthew. We knew they weren't going to keep Whitaker. Josh Jackson was the only one that we were like,
maybe
because he's a veteran, but he's just so unathletic that and that's the thing that kills me is you look at a guy that was a second round pick that was a good ball player at Iowa, but you just see where that lack of athleticism hinders him making plays on the ball because he knows where to be. He's in the right area. He just seems to always be a step late, and out of reach. And so, those were the ones. And then obviously the safety position, we were kind of curious. I know a lot of people wanted to see Tay Daly stay, but he might be a guy that's a candidate to come back if they put Charles Washington on the IR designated return. And
Taylor's going to be interesting because he was wave injured. He's going to go to injured reserve. So
is he?
Yeah, because he got hurt.
Okay.
He got hurt on the touchdown play that when the Titans won the game.
Oh, jeez.
He got hurt on his last defense on the last snap of the preseason that he played. He got hurt on that touchdown play.
And so maybe you get somebody like Wiggins come back if they think he can offer anything in the special teams. And so those are the things you look at, right? Like what you can't lose Washington because or Turner because they're like literally special teams aces. But if you're going to put Washington on the IR designated return and you got to bring somebody back, who's it got to be, right? And so, or who would you have to cut to, then bring back? And you, let's be honest, the way Wiggins played this preseason, it's like, well, we can cut James Wiggins. Nobody's going to pick him up, right? And so that'll be here's what I'll say to Cardinals fans, and you'll be listening to this after practice squads are filled and then change and all that stuff already. But like, look at the names of Cardinals, these guys that that some people love, that you fell in love with, the Chandler Wootons, the Tay Dailies, those names that you're like, or Jesse Luketa, like, I can't believe they got cut, and then see where they end up. Like if they end up getting picked up on a roster, well, one, that means they have to be on the opening day roster. Remember that. So there's going to be a lot of guys that are going to get to practice squads easy, or they're going to choose to go to a different practice squad, because that is an option that a lot of these guys have. Remember, is that they can, Jesse Luketa could be like, oh, I thought I was going to make this roster. Now I'm upset. I'm going to hold a grudge and go, sign on the Seahawks practice squad, whatever. I'm just making up a team, but like that is something that can happen, because if he signs on the active roster with the Seahawks, he has to be on the roster. So is it 2 weeks or is it just a week that they have to be on a roster?
I think they commit. So it's not a matter of how long they're on the roster. They're committed to, I think it's the same rule as if they sign someone off someone else's practice squad. They're committing 3 weeks of pay. 3 weeks of pay.
That's what it is. Yeah. Which is good also for the guys. Cause like we said, like I pulled up Greg Dortch, for instance. Dortch last year made $130,000. So that's what, and don't get me wrong, $130,000 is a good salary. It's good money, but the amount that he has to invest in himself, from nutrition to training to all of that stuff to make sure that he can come back this year and then get a chance to earn that $895,000.
Yeah, the back of the roster / practice squad is not a glamorous life.
So it's just interesting to see how they built this roster up, because I think that it was an easy call, and that's something that we've talked about before. And I'm not going to say it's going to guarantee that they're going to be a good team again this year, but that's typically what you have with good teams, right? You don't have these, unless it's a veteran salary cap situation, you don't have these shocked cuts and moves that are made.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on and actually talk about who's on the roster. What are the surprise players who made it? And what are some potential moves we see happening in the next 24 hours? That's coming up next on Rise Up C Red. We're back on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. And we talked about the surprise. We talked about the players who didn't make the roster. Let's talk about the players who did. We're kind of going through the roster. Quarterback, I think there was no surprise there. Were you surprised that all 5 of the running backs made it? There was some allusions to that in the broadcast that they could go with all 5 running backs. So you've got James Conner, Eno Benjamin, Darrell Williams, Jonathan Ward, and Keontae Ingram. I am a little surprised that all 5, but I am also not sure. Like I'm not 100% convinced that they're going to keep all 5 on the roster, because I suspect perhaps Jonathan Ward could be a player that goes on injured reserve. He was doing some limited work yesterday, but unless they just like Ingram that much that they're going to give him the Eno Benjamin treatment his first year.
Yeah, and so it'll be interesting to kind of follow that, because 5 is so many running backs, right?
I mean, unless you're the Baltimore Ravens, if you run a Baltimore Ravens offense, that makes sense.
And maybe they're going to run the ball more.
But even still, I mean, like how many, like even if they keep like 4 running backs active on game days, that's, I mean, James Conner is going to get, and I'm going to think about it this way. He played 59% of the snaps last year, but that was partially because of injury. Kenyon Drake, when he was the main guy, played 60% of the snaps, but got, probably 80% of the touches. I see James Conner playing a similar role. How much is Eno going to play, and how much is Darrell Williams going to play? It's going to be interesting to see. But yeah, I personally wouldn't be shocked if we saw Jonathan Ward land on injured reserve initially. I know they like him. I mean, and that's why he's been on the roster. This is the 3rd year in a row he's been on the roster. He made the team as an undrafted rookie 2 seasons ago, but I don't know if you can sustainably have 5 running backs on the roster all year.
Not unless you're going to do a lot of what's that old
wishbone
wildcat
wishbone.
Yeah, and you're going to be like, hey, James.
But they have all the receivers too. So
yeah,
and a great tight end in Zach Ertz. Like, how many running backs are you going to put on the field?
Yeah, and so that's just, it's an interesting one. I was a little surprised to see that Steven Anderson was released, just because the Max Williams situation is so unsure. And then Ertz has been dealing with, was it a back or a hamstring?
It's a calf injury.
Yeah, I knew it was something on the backside of the body.
So I'm guessing with Anderson being released, it tells us that Max Williams is likely going to be ready for week 1.
And it may just be in an emergency role. Like, he may not have
they always like to have 3 tight ends active.
But it may just be that they're so confident in
McBride.
In Ertz and McBride's availability that they're just like, okay, like Max is our break in case of emergency until week 4 or 5, and then go from there. Like you said, the Hayes situation, kind of surprising. I know some people were surprised Isabella made the roster. I honestly wasn't.
I'll be surprised if he stays on the roster, because
I think that's more it, unless they're not going to do anything until Wesley gets back.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Because
the interesting thing is that that the report that came out today, Isabella wanted to be traded. He wants to be traded because he wants the opportunity to play. Because if he's wide receiver 6 on this roster, he's not going to be active on game days.
Right.
And that's the thing with me with Isabella is like, what value does he give the team as wide receiver 6? Because he offers nothing on special teams. Greg Dortch is a better returner. And if you're wide receiver 6 and you're not on the field, because he's not going to play ahead of Hollywood. He's not going to play ahead of Moore. He's not going to play ahead of AJ. And his best work, he does, honestly, Andy has proven that he can play outside and win outside. The problem is they don't need anybody. They don't need him playing outside because they have better players. Why? He offers you nothing as a 6th receiver.
Maybe he's the Brown backup until Hopkins is back type situation. That's the only thing I could really speculate is you're saying because Brown,
honestly, I think he's the green because I think he's been playing Z, and I think that Wesley, because he played the X last year, Wesley would be kind of the backup X. And
that's
gives
what I
them
mean.
the backup Z, and then obviously you've got Dortch the backup slot.
So it'll just be it'll be interesting to see how it breaks down. I'm assuming, like you said, they're only going to have 5 until Wesley comes back, if he gets IR'd. If they're 6, then maybe they're just seeing if they can get anything for him at all.
Yes, can someone? Damn you, a 7th round pick. We'll take some. The 7th round pick's fine, even if it's 2024. Right, exactly. But as long as you trade that 7, everyone knows if you follow me, I don't like 7th round picks when it comes to the draft. But acquire them now. You can take all the 7th round picks, and then we can trade them away for somebody that you don't want to have anymore, and we don't have to draft guys in the 7th round anymore. But
Exactly.
I wasn't shocked Isabella made the roster. I was surprised just because in terms of how the Cardinals build their roster, wide receiver 6 has traditionally been for someone like Trent Sherfield or Jerron Brown, who offers you upside on special teams, what Andy has not done thus far. Like they've used him at gunner, but I think there were better options on the team to do. I think that's the case. The only time he was used is because it was out of necessity.
Right. I would agree with that. So you just kind of, it's one of those ones to watch. We'll definitely see how it goes. What was your reaction moving over to the other side of the ball? Because I don't think there was any other surprises really on offense. What was your reaction to Neiman making the roster?
I'll be honest. I didn't realize he made the roster until I was looking at a roster break, and I'm like, "Oh, Neiman made the roster." I didn't like.
I kind of was this. I was
like,
kind
wait,
of the same way.
he's on the roster, and I'm like, they have 6 inside linebackers. Why? But I mean, when he was signed, it kind of signaled it was going to be Neiman or Walker, and I'll be honest. I think on several of because I've been doing a roster prediction basically every week since the start of training camp, and I think I had 6 inside backers several times, and so it came down to, for me, that it was going to come down to Vallejo, Walker, and Neiman for 2 spots, and we know what we have in Walker, which isn't much, and I wasn't sure that they held Vallejo in the same esteem as they did a season ago, but once the preseason started, you realized, based on the way they had the depth chart set up, that Vallejo was getting the same treatment as starters. And so, like, I guess Vallejo's making it. Neiman on the roster, I don't know what the purpose of having that is, and maybe it's simply because maybe the team, even though they list Isaiah Simmons as a linebacker, really kind of consider him a safety.
Yeah, and that's what my thought process was too. Is that like,
so you got Vallejo, 5 inside linebackers and a unicorn,
right? Well, and the reality is, we know that, and I don't mean this in a negative way. It's going to sound super negative, but every time you play Tanner Vallejo extended time, he gets injured. So, and we know that he is a very valuable special teams player. So, maybe their thought process is right now, Neiman can fill the role, and we don't have to worry about Vallejo. I'm just kind of spitballing because it was a little odd decision to make. Like you said, it means they have 5 inside backers, but when you discount that, you don't really want Turner on the field, and Simmons could be more of like a safety, outside backer, corner type of guy.
With Simmons on a roster, it makes it very interesting because he is going to play the edge, he's going to play linebacker, and he's going to play some defensive back. So if you and the truth is, he's been doing drills with the safeties for a couple of months. So in all practicality, it's more like they have 5 safeties and 5 inside linebackers instead of having 6 inside backers and 4 safeties. And so it's kind of like you've got 4 safeties, 5 inside backers, and a unicorn.
Right. And so you just have to look at it. I'm honestly a little just surprised that they kept him, but Ledbetter we talked about. I know people want to see Manny Jones. Ledbetter gives you a little more.
Ledbetter is an interesting one because I didn't realize this, and I was looking. I was like, "Oh, he came into the league the same year as Dogby," and so their defense is really young now because you've got J.J. Watt, and then the rest of the defensive line is 2019 or later. You've got Simmons and Collins at outside linebacker. You've got, you now have 3 players in Demikagi, Myjai Sanders, Cameron Thomas that are 2 years or in year 2 or less. You've got Marco Wilson his second year. Christian Matthew is in his rookie season. And so basically you've got, and the fact that Deontay Thompson and Jalen Thompson are both 2019 guys. This is suddenly a very young defense.
It is. It's an extremely young defense, and we'll see how this pans out. Because the only guy that's shown kind of the juice to be a dog next to Watt is Allen, and he's got some of the same availability issues we've seen with other guys. So you have a lot of guys that are the Corey Peters role, which is great if you have other players around them, and that can be a little more spectacular at times.
I know they love Rashard Lawrence. I know they're still high on Lucky Fotu.
And both of
Ledbetter
them have
is
role.
Sneaky, and also Dogby has progressed really nice. And so what you have are very capable players with some playmaking ability that maybe it's granted, JJ, Zach, Allen, Fotu, and Lawrence have all had injury concerns, all of them. But maybe rather than having broken down vets, they'd rather bet on youth to play up front. And it's important because these are all, and they're not rookies, so they're all youth that's been in the system multiple years now.
Well, and it's one of those things that we've talked about too, is that like when you have X amount of needs and Y amount of money, you can't just fill all the needs, and they feel like they owe Allen, Lawrence, and Fotu one more run. Obviously they can't do anything with Watt, and then they just Dogby and Ledbetter as their kind of back end of the rotation guys, which are good to have.
Yeah.
So it's not a bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. It's just also it's also just different because you would expect it at some point to be upgraded, and I think we can say the same thing for the cornerback position, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Well, and even the edge position. I mean, they finally addressed it this year with the Sanders and Cam Thomas, but it's going to be really interesting to see, especially after the Canard cut. I think that was the biggest surprise for you and I and it came yesterday on Monday, that Canard was going to get cut because
they're going all in with the youth.
I mean, and not just the youth, but like think about the fact that they're probably going to start Dennis Gardeck opposite Marcus Golden.
Maybe I don't know, or is it going to be DeMcKG?
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, DeMcKG has a lot of similarities to Canard outside of that. Canard's just got 4 or 5 years experience on him, and so, but from a physicality, like stylistic standpoint, DeMcKG and Canard aren't that different. So maybe that's what they're thinking.
Which would be, honestly, if DeMcKG turns into something decent, what a pick. What a pick that was a year ago, because that was the last year. We're like, okay, we've got this, Marcus Golden light, and Marcus Golden is kind of special in himself. So how could you expect? So he was. I'll admit, I liked what he did in the preseason, and knowing the praise that he got from Cliff Kingsbury in press conference during the training camp, there was a shot, but I wasn't certain. It's not like I could bet a house payment on him making the roster, but he might be a starter. This might be, for lack of a better comparison, it's kind of when they threw Marco Wilson into the starting lineup last year, where even though Malcolm Butler retired, we kind of have felt that was partially maybe because of they were going to go with Marco instead. But, Dimikagi, I'm certain Devon Canard is the better player over Dimikagi right now. But we also know Canard's ceiling. And if Dimikagi is close to that with more upside, why not?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of just what it is, right? I think they're looking at it. The reason it struck you and I so much as odd is just because there's such little financial relief from this.
Yeah, yes, they have to actively pay Canard $600,000, and maybe he's a guy they bring back to the practice. If he doesn't find anything elsewhere,
or what happens if they just flat out bring him back?
That's a possibility. So let's talk about that then. So my candidates to go on injured reserve potentially the short-term type of situation. I feel like Charles Washington's probably, if there's anyone, Charles Washington has a good shot at that. Maybe Jonathan Ward, maybe Antoine Wesley. And then you look at, I wondered if Justin Pugh was in that scenario, but I think it sounds like he has a chance for week 1. But if Pugh is might be ready for week 1, it makes the Cody Ford trade seem more weird, except for and I think it might have just been the case when Justin Murray, because he got released with an injury settlement, is that Murray just couldn't stay healthy. Because last year he had the back injury, started to come back, had a setback, hurt the ankle in camp this year, and it might have been they literally lost their comfort level depth. And I thought it was more about Pugh, but maybe it was all about Murray.
Yeah, and that's what's really interesting, because you and I talked about it last week and when the trade went down, and we weren't sure what this meant. And then obviously he's taking those left guard reps, and then you get the fun speculation that Pugh's upset with the Cardinals because they told him he was going to play center and now he's playing guard again. It's like, guys, he literally just got hurt. Not everything's a deep-seated,
he knows left guard. He was trying center to see if he could.
Right. It's not always as nefarious as everybody wants to make it. Trust me, as much as people want it to be a soap opera, it's really not that much. And so this was obviously on the heels of Hayes getting hurt. And so I do wonder, because Murray's had some injury issues of his own, right? He's been a little nicked up throughout his career, if I remember right. And so I'm wondering if it was more they're looking at this as like, hey, Cody Ford is a guy that can play similar to Murray, and hasn't had injury issues when he's actually being asked to play.
Yeah, he's younger, cheaper, no durability issues.
Yeah, and again, this is spitballing, but kind of, I think you and I mean, neither of us predicted Murray on the roster last week, so I think you and I both saw the writing on the wall of this is what was going to go down because of the trade for Ford.
But the fact that he got released with an injury settlement also gives some clarity to the situation as well.
Right. And then, I don't know. I mean, when you look at the guys who could be coming back, and you look at it from that vantage point and you say, okay, well, like we said, Canard, Steven Anderson, like maybe, I mean, could they IR Max Williams, do you think?
They could. They could viably do that if they think that he's going to be out, but I doubt that would be the case, because if there was a possibility, they would have just kept him on PUP.
Right, but
I mean, well, let's forget that. They did that with Dennis Gardeck last year, and then they put him on IR to start the year after he hurt his hand or something.
And if on PUP, it still would have been 4 games?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to look here. I mean, I know people love Chandler Wooten. We just talked about the linebacker position. Are they going to throw a 6-1 in there? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I just don't see anybody that like screams outside of, like you said, or their Brewer situation. And that's really it. I mean, barring an injury, obviously barring an injury is something different completely, but like, I think Brewer comes back, you're gonna IR at least 1, maybe 2 guys, and so then it'll depend. Like, I would assume, and this is an assumption, obviously, but I would assume if they IR Washington, they bring Wiggins back, wouldn't you? Just because of the special teams aspect. But,
like
but if
Washington's out, I think Wiggins is the only option you have, because what else are they going to do at safety?
Well, it's actually interesting because a couple of really good key veteran special teamers were actually released. And so I'm not saying that it could happen, but maybe that just changes the like guarantee if Washington gets put on the 4-week IR that, Wiggins is the guy coming back. Now, I haven't looked at like all the names, but following a lot of the beat guys, they talked about, wow, I think it was the Dolphins maybe. They were like, wow, key defensive back special teams guy cut. Like, so those might be names to watch, similar to how they ended up with Washington in the first place, right?
Yeah, pretty much. That's kind of what that was.
So, but yeah, I mean, I just don't see anything crazy. And like you said, I don't know. I feel like they got it for the most part right. I mean, like I said, there wasn't anything glaring at all.
Yeah. All right. Coming up next on the Rise Up Secret podcast, the Mcsorley Cardinals talking the web. Let's talk about the trade they made. Finally, they traded for a cornerback, and maybe it's a surprise who that was. That's coming next on Rise Up C-Red. Back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the Mr. Cardinals talk on the web. The Cardinals finally made their cornerback trade. We were expecting a cornerback trade, and then we got an offensive lineman trade. But it happened. On cutdown day, the Cardinals made a deal with the Las Vegas Raiders, interestingly enough, who their Week 2 opponent, to acquire Trayvon Mullen Jr., former second-round pick in 2019. And he's long, he's athletic, former teammate of Isaiah Simmons at Clemson. They get him for a 7th-round pick, a conditional 7th-round pick that could become a 6th-rounder depending on playing time. What is there to know about this kid? I'll be honest, I don't remember much of him when it coming out. But, I mean, you look at the measurables, he's long, he's got some speed. And I will say, was it you or was it Blake that sent that tweet in the group chat that said, like, it was the funniest description I've heard, that he is a 24-year-old, 30-year-old Patrick Peterson.
Yeah, that was Blake. And yeah, I mean, you look at it, he hasn't lived up to the billing in the NFL. Some of that has definitely been injury issues. And, people are going to roll their eyes, that now you've got another guy that's had injury issues, but it is what it is. I mean, we've talked about this. You weren't getting a star at this season. without giving up multiple first round picks. And so, for them to be able to get Trayvon Mullen, I think it speaks to, what we've seen from Steve Keim consistently, and that's just his ability to find a way to get intriguing pieces to put together. I mean, we talked about obviously Mullen, we talked about Cody Ford, we talked about Will Hernandez, right? All those guys are kind of in the same-ish boat, when you say, like, guys that haven't necessarily lived up to the expectations of their draft position, and so they're getting a change of scenery with a chance to excel. It's interesting to look through Mullen's career. In 2019 when he was drafted, he played a ton. I think 675 snaps. He had decent coverage grade. Looking at his numbers here, pass breakups, he ended up with 8 and an interception in let's see, what did he play? He ended up playing, in 675 snaps. 2 years ago, he had 11 pass breakups and 2 interceptions, which is actually really, really good, in 933 defensive snaps. Solid, coverage grade, and last year dealt with injuries and only played 229 snaps, finished with 2 pass breakups and an interception. So, like, he's a guy that's consistently, shown improvement. His biggest issue's been, I think, for me, a lot of it's been usage. I don't think his skill set, was necessarily utilized correctly by the Raiders, and we've seen that. And so he tended to have more penalties than you would want to see. But like his size, speed, ability to press, it'll be interesting to see how they use him. I'm interested to see if he can become a competent cornerback too, because he has a lot of the requisite things that you want to see, especially with his feet and hips and his ability to, break on the ball.
Isn't he a little bit different? So, like, when they went out and signed Jeff Gladney, one of the things they kind of liked was it was kind of like a younger version of Robert Alford, with a little bit of versatility. Like, he could play inside, outside. They view Byron Murphy as a stronger inside guy, but he can play outside. Marco Wilson, they believe, can play inside. Got some versatility. Mullen is more strictly boundary, isn't he?
Yeah, he's going to be a strictly boundary type of guy. He's an outside guy. Like I said, 6'2", 200 pounds. He was a mid 4.4 guy. Those are, he's a long, kind of lanky. You look at him as that type of corner that can kind of match up and play against
like the DK Metcalfs
receivers. Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Like bigger receivers. Like he's gonna be that guy. I think he's a better fit in like a zone situation. So we'll see how that pans out. But like I like him. I think it was a good trade, and it's like the Hernandez, it's like the Ford situation. It gives them an opportunity to grade a guy up close and then make a decision.
Well, and they're kind of in a situation where it seems like Antonio Hamilton might be one of those guys that goes IR, because we don't know what's wrong.
Yeah, that was another good one. We
don't know what's wrong. And it sounded like, last week it seemed to suggest that Hamilton probably wouldn't be there for week 1. And now on Tuesday, he's saying hopefully he'll be back sooner rather than later, which seems to suggest there is something going on, which is interesting because of how it was. They didn't say when they said he missed practice, it wasn't because of an MRI. He had a doctor's appointment, which almost makes it sound less injury and more illness, maybe, which will, I don't know what to think because Cliff would not elaborate. He said, well, you have to wait till it's on the injury report, and we'll find out next week if it's a body part injury or if it ends up being like illness. But we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But as it was, if you were going into the season with 4 cornerbacks on the roster with Byron Murphy, Marco Wilson, Antonio Hamilton, and rookie Christian Matthew, and you aren't going to have you're not going to have Hamilton available, that's not exactly what you want going into week 1 against the Kansas City Chiefs. And the possible plus is the fact that Mullen played the last 3 seasons in the AFC West. And so even if he isn't completely up to speed in the Cardinal scheme, he is familiar with the opponent.
Yeah, and that's what I think they saw in him. And again, the pickings are slim, guys. It's not. There's not.
This obviously. There's something. This obviously. They think Rob Alford is done because they could have signed him at any point.
And who knows? Maybe they still do. I mean, honestly, who knows?
That's
but
true.
The reality of the situation is, when you look at it, I'm trying to find. There you go. All the cuts that were made. I'm just kind of whirling through here quickly today. But there was nobody. There was just nobody that you're just like, oh, this team, is going to get rid of this player. And you look at some of the situations that end up happening. For instance, you had a guy like what's the guy's name out of New York, the Jets, the offensive lineman that they were trying to get rid of. And talks broke down in the last second and they ended up just having to cut him. We would have heard more about a corner that's really good or that teams that is young. The whole reason the Cardinals traded a 7th that turns into a 6 is because they didn't want to have to hope that Mullen gets to them at waivers. The rest of these guys, they're like, hey, if we get them on waivers, that'll be fine. But or they're a veteran that they can go have a conversation with and go look at. But I'm literally just scrolling, through all the names and nothing really stands out where you're like, oh, why didn't they try to go get this guy? Because it's not like they could trade for a guy that's made a roster. What teams are giving up good cornerbacks at this point?
Nope. Nobody's trying to give up cornerbacks at this point. So obviously the Raiders were going to cut him. Basically,
are the Raiders? They've cut. I mean, they cut Alex freaking Leatherwood, who was their first round pick.
They are purging themselves of the Mayock Gruden era.
Yeah, they really are, and Leatherwood. It's interesting because obviously he's got to pass through waivers, but and his salary's way bigger. So don't take this the wrong way, but Leatherwood would be the type of guy that you're like, oh, maybe we didn't need to trade for Cody Ford. Now, again, I don't think he's going to get to the 23rd, but if you're the team that has the 5th or 6th waiver spot and you traded for Cody Ford for a 5th rounder, you're like, oh man, really? We would have traded a 5th rounder for Alex Leatherwood if you would have given us a heads up, Raiders. But yeah, I mean, there just wasn't any of those. You want to go get Malcolm Butler back? He got cut today.
Yeah, I don't think the Cardinals trust him anymore.
Right, exactly.
Coming next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the Mr. Cardinals talk on the web. Let's wrap this up, talk about some players we think could come back to the press squad and any other moves that we think that they need to do. That's coming next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the Best Our Cardinals talk on the web. Of the players that were released, who do you think are the most likely to be practice squatters? I'm going to go, so here are my practice squad locks. Jace Whitaker is a lock that's been kind of reported as such. I don't think anyone's going to go after him. Receiver Andre Bocelli, they like him. Chandler Wooten, Trace Mcsorley, Jesse Luketa. Then you go with.
Do you think they're going to take? You think they're going to take Mcsorley over Garantano?
I think so. I think what I believe in terms of why they gave him all that playing time is that gives him a familiarity with the offense. And so if they end up in a scenario where Kyler gets hurt or McCoy gets hurt and they need him to be the backup, it's not frantic because he got a lot of reps.
What is your opinion on Trey Kirkland or Javonte Payton? I
wouldn't be surprised if both of them make the practice squad. I don't know how many receivers you're going to keep on the practice squad with 16, but I could see. I don't know about Victor Bolden. That's
he struggled. He had some, he wasn't as good. I think they would like to bring back Manny Jones.
Yes, Manny Jones I believe is a lock. And then after that, maybe Wiggins. I don't know how but he might get re-signed to the roster, honestly.
Right. Wiggins is a wait-and-see type of situation because, again, if Washington's healthy, I think they cut Wiggins and are kind of moving on from him.
And find another safety, finding other young safety to put on the practice squad.
Right. If Washington IRs, then I think Wiggins was the guy that they were hoping to pass through and get back. Because knowing that they'll practice squad him or release him in 4 or 5 weeks when Washington is healthy. But that's the way I look at the Wiggins situation. Like you said, Wooten, Whitaker.
I could see Isadora coming back. It's not unlimited this year. You've got a 16-man practice squad, but it's not like you can fill it with 16 veterans.
Right.
It used to be the 8-man practice squad, and you could have up to 2 players who had more than the one credited year, but they couldn't have more than 2 credited years. There are 6 on the practice squad that can be of any experience level, and so that's where Devon Canard, Steven Anderson, Danny Isadora, those type of guys could be, or even like Antoine Woods, defensive lineman, those guys could come back. Joe Walker, who spent time on the practice squad last year. If we can't, Joe Walker. I wouldn't be surprised to see him back, but I'm not going to say he's going to come back. But let me just say, I would not be. Joe Walker on a Cardinals team would never surprise me.
Well, that's kind of how I feel about Coda Martin.
He was on the practice squad the last 2 years, and so he knows the system. He clearly is a player that they like some.
Right. And so that's what I mean. Is a guy like Coda Martin, he's your prototype guy that ends up on the practice squad every year, and you're like, you can't do any better. But at the same time, they're like, well, no, we do better every year. That's why he's on the practice squad.
Yeah. But in that way, at least he's been taught in the team's technique, knows the offensive system, and all that sort of thing.
And here's what I'll say. We talked about it at the beginning of the show a little bit. You've got guys like you were saying, you got guys like Jesse Luketa, Manny Jones, who was the Chandler Wooten. You've got these guys that fans gravitated towards, and they played well. Don't
the
get me
undrafted
wrong.
Guys always grab us every year,
and they undoubtedly played well. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But when you look at it, you have to look at it like Tay Gowan. Remember, Cardinals fans were actually upset that they included Tay Gowan in the Eagles trade. Well, if you want him, you can go get him.
Yes,
I mean,
he got really, he got the Tom Brady of cornerbacks, right?
Right. When you look at it again, we've talked about a lot of the guys that have been here through the years, the Cappies and the Vontarius Doras of the world, and teams, fans seem to really kind of fall in love with those guys, and then get bent out of shape. Let's see what happens with Lucetta, Manny Jones, and Chandler Wooten. Like, if they end up getting picked up by another team, tip your caps. One, be happy for them. Now they get to play and they don't have to sit. But two, you were right. Like, you guys were right. Cardinals shouldn't have cut them. They're obviously good enough players because other teams wanted them. But like, a lot of times these guys get cut and then they don't ever find another spot, or they come back to this practice squad. Like, it's silly to get upset until we see the final outcome. Now, if you're like, oh, I thought they should be on the roster. Well, I mean, again, like Manny Jones, who are you going to place? Jonathan Ledbetter? Okay, so like now we're like nitpicking, right? If you wanted to keep Lucetta over, who are you? Who are you keeping Lucetta over? Like, if you want to keep Wooten over Ben Neiman, Jess and I probably agree from what they did this preseason, but it also is a situation where if you get into a game and you've got to play your fourth string linebacker, maybe you want a guy that's actually been on the field and called the defense before in the NFL rather than a undrafted rookie out of Auburn. Like, that's just
not only that, but so it's a limited athletic undrafted rookie out of Auburn.
Right. And so like, it's not taking shots at these guys. We like them all. We want to see them succeed. But until it's all, the dust settles and these guys either sign elsewhere on active rosters or are back on the practice squad or don't come back, let it play out. Like I said, the Jesse Liminaire thing was a perfect example. Like, people were upset that he got cut after having a good, first half of the preseason game, having what was said a good camp, and nobody's picked him up. Like, that happens all the time. He performs well in situations or a player does, and then they don't get picked up anywhere else. Like I said, Cappy and Vontarius Dora are like,
never done anything. Never done anything.
Well, and I joked with my buddies about it, like, Cappy, Vontarius Dora, every wide receiver that Larry Fitzgerald said was going to be really good. I mean, because remember, Fitz's track record of like picking out like the receivers that are going to be good is not good. If he talked about them getting out of like camp and stuff, it was basically a death knell to their career, unfortunately. Obviously talking about undrafted guys, but so like, let's let it all play out. Let's see where it ends up, and then we can get bent out of shape on. But I think outside of Canard and then Lucetta, because of Canard, I don't think there was anything kind of surprising or eye-opening.
Would you expect to see, if the Cardinals make any other moves, where do you see them making it? Do you think that they could bring in another cornerback? Would you see them addressing the edge at all, or the defensive line?
I was going to say corner or D-line, I think. I think that's really the two position spots that they may still look to bring back, bring in. But yeah, like, I don't see a guy where you're just like, again, that you're just like, hey, this guy's 100% better.
All right. Well, then, we will wrap up this edition of the show, episode 370. We'll be back in next week where we can talk about what we'll do next week is kind of a season preview / expectation for week 1. We've got a week of practice this week. Next week, game week.
Week 1's going to be fun, man. I mean,
all the points probably.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And, I know some fans are very nervous about the game. The Chiefs are a good team, but like they've got a lot of question marks themselves. They've got, question marks at wide receiver.
On defense, honestly.
On defense, they've got question marks all over the place. Like, people were really, really excited about Chris Jones and Danny Shelton, and then Danny Shelton was cut today. They're starting a rookie corner. They've got some super, super athletic linebackers that are good, but it'll be interesting because I think Cardinals fans are more afraid than they probably need to be at this point. I mean, again, could be wrong, but I wouldn't say that you're playing the 85 Bears here. I think the Chiefs are an excellent team, but the already fear thing is kind of funny to me.
Nope. That's what we'll talk about next week. Season preview, previewing the Cardinals against Chiefs. That'll wrap the wrap on this show. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Ruth. This is Rise of C Red Podcast. We will back again next week. Thanks for listening, as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C Red Podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, Sea Red, and of course, Rise up, Sea Red.